Hi, I'm Steve Flatt. Welcome to the Amazing Grace Bible class. Today's Amazing Grace class is a very special edition. This week and next, we want to document for you a trip that 57 of us made last April to the nation of Israel. We visited some magnificent sites, places where Abraham, David, Solomon, Jesus, Peter, and Paul all walked. And we want to bring these places into your home so that you can share in the inspiration that we received. The bulk of our group left Nashville on April the 12th at 1 p.m. We flew to New York City where we met other tour participants, and together we headed across the Atlantic Ocean. We flew Olympic Airlines, and our itinerary called for a 5-hour layover in Athens, Greece. There we boarded a bus and traveled beside the beautiful Aegean Sea through the modern city to the historic ruins of the Acropolis. The word Acropolis comes from two smaller Greek words, akro, which means edge, and polis, which means city. And sure enough, the Acropolis was located exactly on the edge of Athens. The ruins of the Acropolis include the famous Parthenon, temple to the goddess Athena, along with temples to Zeus, Poseidon, and other forms of deity. We've begun our journey in the city of Athens, and right now we're standing on the Acropolis, where the Parthenon and other ancient temple ruins exist. This is also the site of a great moment in biblical history. Remember in Acts chapter 17, where Paul argued with the Epicureans and the Stoics at Mars Hill, or the Areopagus. Well, down below me is the site where that occurred. Behind me, down at the very foot of the hill, was the Agora, or the marketplace, where it's estimated that there may have been up to 25,000 different public statues to different gods. It was in the Agora that there was the statue to the unknown God that Paul referred to in Acts 17. But it was on the Areopagus, that solid rock down below me here, where there was the courthouse and the public square, and where a great deal of philosophical and judicial business was carried on. That's where Paul made his great speech that we read in Acts 17. From Athens, we flew to Tel Aviv. There we stayed at the Barron Heights Hotel, a lovely new resort just north of the Tel Aviv area, overlooking the Mediterranean. Tel Aviv is a beautiful modern city on the coast of the Mediterranean. It's the center of trade and commerce for the nation of Israel. Tel Aviv engulfs the ancient city of Joppa, whose ruins are still visible. Joppa, you may remember, was the seaport town the prophet Jonah fled to when disobeying the command from God to go to Nineveh and preach repentance to the people there. At Joppa, old Jonah boarded a ship headed to Tarshish, but, well, you remember how his voyage became interrupted as he became the temporary appetizer for a great fish. In the New Testament, Joppa is the place where Peter was staying, in the house of Simon the tanner, when he received the vision from the Lord of the unclean animals descending on a sheet, and the voice of God saying, "Arise and kill and eat." Immediately thereafter, he left Joppa with messengers from the household of Cornelius, a Gentile, and, well, we'll cover what happened there in a moment. From Joppa, our group traveled to the Valley of Elah, the site of perhaps the most famous battle in history, between a giant named Goliath and a boy named David. As you looked around the hills, you could almost see the Israelite and Philistine armies lined up, watching their champions battle below. Our tour group even had a little fun reenacting that battle between David and Goliath within hundreds of yards of where it would have occurred. Beth Shemesh was the next stop on tour. Beth Shemesh was the small community where the Ark of the Covenant returned. After bringing disaster to the Philistine camp, the Philistine leaders placed the Ark on a cart with jewels and gold and let 2 oxen lead it back. In 1 Samuel chapter 6, the oxen brought the cart and the Ark of the Covenant to the little village of Beth Shemesh. We closed our first full day on tour at Caesarea. Caesarea was built by Herod the Great between 22 and 10 BC. and it has become one of the great archaeological discoveries of this century. Still standing are parts of the aqueducts, which brought fresh water from the foothills of Mount Carmel 13 miles away. A number of ruins have been uncovered, including this breathtaking theater overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. This theater, partially reconstructed now, could well have been the place Paul made his historic defense before King Herod Agrippa, recorded for us in Acts chapter 26. As you may remember, it was also the site of one of our Amazing Grace Bible class tapings. Oh, and Caesarea was also the home of Cornelius, that Gentile centurion who sent the messengers to Peter at Joppa. When Peter arrived and taught Cornelius the gospel, he and his family became the first Gentile Christians.
We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, the beautiful city of God.
Father, as we look over this ocean, sit in this theater, it all becomes so much more real to us. The words come off the page and they come to life. Thank you for the opportunity to tape this class here. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. On day 2, our tour group traveled to Mount Carmel. Carmel literally means the vineyard of the Lord, and the mountain is covered with beautiful olive trees. The mountain is actually more of a ridge of mountains in northern Israel with a magnificent view. Mount Carmel has multiple references in Scripture, but the best known is the story of Elijah's contest with the prophets of Baal in 1 Kings 18. Here's a statue erected in memory of that event.
All the way to the back, we have the mountains of Gilead. Okay, that's already Jordan. So look at from this spot, which is close to the Mediterranean, not too far from the Mediterranean, you're already looking at the other side of the country across the Jordan River. We can't see the Jordan River, of course, because it's all the way down in the canyon, but we have the mountains on the other side of the Jordan. And that's very rare from this spot to be able to see Gilead, which is nice because Elijah was born in Gilead.
Do you remember the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal? In a nutshell, 2 altars were erected, one to Baal and one to the Jehovah God. After hours of coaxing their God, the prophets of Baal finally collapsed exhausted. But then Elijah had his turn. He had his altar soaked with 12 barrels full of water, enough to form a moat around the altar. And then he called upon the name of Jehovah God. And fire came from heaven, consuming not only the bullock on the altar, but all of the water, the stones, and everything around it. Then Elijah called upon the children of Israel to seize the prophets of Baal and to slay them, which they did. Oh, incidentally, legend has it that their bodies were buried in this mound that you see, which is directly below Mount Carmel. Afterwards, Elijah prayed for rain, and a messenger came and told him a cloud over the Mediterranean was rising, a cloud as small as a man's hand. And then he sent word to Ahab to prepare for the rain that was coming, and Elijah took off and ran 18 miles to Jezreel, running through this beautiful valley, outrunning even the chariot of Ahab in the middle of a torrential downpour. After Mount Carmel, we traveled through the modern city of Haifa, overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. There we stopped briefly at a shrine designating the traditional spot of Elijah's cave, the place in 1 Kings 19 where he hid, fearing what his future might be. Today our group is at Megiddo, which is a mound area, a tell, and in that tell they have excavated 20 different cities, one built on top of another over the 34th century period. I'm standing down at the bottom of a great water well that goes all the way back to the days of Solomon and beyond, where the water was stored. And I'm at an entrance to a tunnel that was built by King Ahab in the 9th century BC. This tunnel was built from the city walls underneath this well to this point where the women could come and get water and then return to the city protected, not having to go outside the city gates. Just part of the fascinating history of Megiddo. At the excavation site were magnificent ruins that depicted life through the centuries on the site, including this round altar that was built by the Canaanites to sacrifice their own children. Also at the excavation site was a detailed model of the ancient city as it existed under the reign of King Ahab. And then surrounding the area is the beautiful plain of Megiddo, where historians speculate that more battles have been fought than at any other single place on the face of the earth. Oh, there's another interesting aspect to this place, Megiddo. You've probably heard of the Battle of Armageddon in Revelation 16, verse 16. The word Armageddon literally means the mount or mountain of Megiddo. There are those who believe that on this site there will one day be a literal physical battle that will bring about the end of the world. But you know, when you're there and you look at the history of the place and understand all of the warfare and battles that have been fought there, it makes you understand the significance of the symbolism of the Battle of Armageddon. There will come that day when the final battle will take place between good and evil, and God and good will prevail. Surely in Revelation 16, that's what's symbolized by this Mount of Megiddo, the place where the battles have been fought through all the centuries, and symbolically, the place where all of it will be wrapped up. Nazareth was our next stop, the boyhood home of Jesus. During his lifetime, Nazareth was merely a wide spot in the road. Today, it's a bustling city. We stopped at a church that covers what's called Mary's Well. This well goes back past the time of Jesus and would surely have been a place he, Mary, and Joseph would have come for water. Millions of tourists through the centuries have stopped for a drink there as well.
And let cool waters cleanse my soul. To the river of Jordan, our Savior went one day. And read how John the Baptist met him there. How John the Baptist met him. When John baptized Jesus in Jordan's rushing waters, the mighty power of God nearly filled the air. I'm on my way to the river of Jordan. Gonna wade right in the rushing water. I'm going down to the river of Jordan, and let cool waters cleanse my soul.
I'm standing on the banks of one of the most historic sites in all the world. This is the Jordan River. It flows from the Sea of Galilee all the way down to the Dead Sea. The Jordan River is mentioned over 200 times in the Bible. The first incidence of its occurrence is in Genesis 13, verse 10. Where it says that Abraham and Lot divided the lands beyond the Jordan, and they went their separate ways. Later, of course, the Jordan River was the boundary that marked the Promised Land as the children of Israel were coming out of Egypt. Moses looked across it from Mount Nebo, but he never was allowed to go in. Joshua led the children of Israel across the Jordan and into Canaan. And then later, when Elijah, the prophet, turned the mantle over to Elisha, it was the Jordan River, 2 Kings chapter 2, that they smote with their mantle or their cloak, and they walked across on dry land. And then Elijah was taken up into heaven in a chariot of fire. But I guess we know the Jordan River most because in Matthew 3, that tells us where Jesus was baptized. He came to John, and John said, "Why, I need to be baptized of you." And Jesus said, "No, suffer it now to fulfill all righteousness." And so John baptized Jesus as he began his ministry. And as he did, the voice of God came from heaven, saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." And the Spirit of God descended upon him as a dove. The Jordan River has an absolutely unmistakable and unique place in biblical history and in history in general.
I'm on my way in the river of Jordan, dip, in the river of Jordan, dip, in the river of Jordan. Let cool waters cleanse my soul. In the river of Jordan, dip, in the river of Jordan, dip, in the river of Jordan, dip, in the river of Jordan. Let cool waters cleanse my soul.
we traveled north to the city of Tiberias. Tiberias is a bustling little seaport town on the edge of the Sea of Galilee. Its history dates it all the way back before the time of Jesus as a Roman colony, though nothing is said about it in the Gospels. Once we checked in late in the afternoon to our hotel, we took some time that evening to enjoy modern Israeli life. Then the next morning, we were treated to one of the most beautiful sunrises that you would ever see, the sun rising over the Sea of Galilee.
They all shall sweetly obey thy will. Peace be still, peace be still. They all shall sweetly obey thy will. Peace, peace be still.
One of the highlights of our trip was actually going out onto the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is really a large lake, pear-shaped, about 9 miles across at the widest point, whose waters empty into the Jordan River and eventually make their way down into the Dead Sea. As we went out on a boat chartered specifically for our group, some of the locals had a little fun using jet skis across our wake. But as we came to the middle of the sea, everything was tranquil, and it was a moment of great inspiration. You could see to the north the Mount of Beatitudes that we'll notice again in more detail in a moment, and the edge of the city of Capernaum. Once we were out on the sea, we stopped for a few moments to reflect upon two great scenes: Jesus stilling the sea, calming the storm, and the time He came walking to the disciples in Matthew 14 when they were in the middle of the sea during a great and terrible storm.
Verse 32 kind of says it all. And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. From being in such a traumatic situation, from being in a situation where suddenly you feel like you're going to lose even your very life, to taking hold of the hand of Jesus and then feeling that peace that surpasses all understanding, and the calmness, even as the calmness of the sea is right now, to feel the serenity and the security of Jesus, to be close with Him. Very beautiful picture, and made even more beautiful by sitting right here in the middle of the sea.
Our guide, Gila, explained to us that though it was calm on the day we were there, how waves could become very treacherous on the Sea of Galilee.
Yeah, it looks very peaceful, but sometimes, in certain times of the year, there's a certain wind that's called a sharkia, and it's kind of the opposite of what we have today. Remember, this morning I was telling you about the Hamsin, that's the hot wind and the hot air that comes in usually from the east or the south. But this comes in directly from the east. It's a cold blast of air that comes over the Golan Heights. We always blame it on the Syrians. And it comes over, and as it descends in altitude, the cold air is hit very suddenly by the warm air here, and it creates a tremendous turbulence. And so it's winds that come in this direction and push and bring up, it could happen within a very short time, 6 to 10 feet waves. And in that case, everything gets blown over here to the western side.
On the other side of the Sea of Galilee, we came to what is traditionally known as the Mount of Beatitudes. Because of its shape and its location, it is almost universally agreed upon as the place where Jesus would have delivered the powerful and magnificent Sermon on the Mount. When we got there, the first thing we were worried about was what we might drink because it was tremendously hot. And so our first order of business was to negotiate with local vendors for the price of bottled water.
Ladies and gentlemen, $1 large mineral water, 1.5 liter for $1. Only $1 large mineral water. Yes, ma'am. Cold mineral water for $1. $1 large mineral water, cold freezer, $1.
Good.
Yeah, it's cold mineral water, sir. Oh, really? Yeah.
When you go.
When we arrived at the Mount of Beatitudes and everyone had a place to sit, we enjoyed what may have been one of the most meaningful experiences of the whole trip. There we read from start to finish the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, the words of Jesus. Just being at the place where Jesus would have delivered those magnificent words brought it all to life. And many of us were touched as we never had been touched before by the words of that magnificent sermon.
See how the lilies of the field grow? They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well.
After the Sea of Galilee and the Mount of Beatitudes, we traveled to the northernmost region of Israel. We came to Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi is mentioned only one time in the Bible, Matthew 16, but it's a momentous occasion. Jesus has asked his disciples there, whom do men say that I am? And they record for him common speculation. But then Jesus asked, whom do you say that I am? And Peter responded, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus exclaimed that flesh and blood hadn't revealed that to Peter, but the Father who was in heaven. And he gave Simon the name Peter, and said, upon this rock, that rock of that confession, I will build my church. I think it's more than coincidental, don't you, that behind me, atop that cave, is that huge slab of rock. And perhaps even from this area where I'm standing, maybe Jesus looked up and used that as a visual aid. Upon this rock, I will build my church. From Caesarea Philippi, we traveled to the northernmost point of Israel. Passing beautiful Mount Hermon, we came to the ancient ruins of the city of Dan. Dan, you may remember, was the capital city for the northern kingdom of Israel after Israel divided during the reign of Rehoboam. From the Galilee region, we began to make our way south once more, and we came to Mount Tabor. The word Tabor means navel, and it literally was given that name because the mount is in the center of everything. We could see this huge mound from a great distance off. And when we arrived and began to go up the mountain, we found we had to go by chartered taxis. The ride up the mountain was something that those of us who participated will never forget. Once we were on top there, we were able to see a beautiful view as we were on top of the mountain that traditionally has been recognized as the site of the great transfiguration in Mark chapter 9. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain where they were there all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He did not know what to say. They were so frightened. Then a cloud appeared and enveloped them, and a voice came from the cloud. This is my Son, whom I love. Listen to him. While going through the Jordan River Valley, we stopped at the ruins of Jezreel, where excavations have really just begun. You may remember the town of Jezreel from the Old Testament. It was the place of the summer palace of wicked King Ahab and Jezebel. It was also the place where Naboth had a vineyard. And through Jezebel's wicked dealings, Naboth was killed and his vineyard was acquired. Oh, but Elijah the prophet gave prophecy that the blood of Ahab would be washed there where Naboth's blood had been spilled, and that Jezebel would die there as well. And sure enough, both those prophecies came true. This is the spring of Harod. And this is the place where in Judges chapter 6, Gideon gathered the Israelite army of 32,000 men to do battle against a Midianite army that would have numbered about 135,000. Well, when they were all camped here, the Lord came to Gideon and said, "You've got too many men." He said, "You tell the ones who want to go back home and who are afraid just to go on." And 22,000 of his 32,000 left. And then the Lord came to Gideon and said, "You've still got too many." He said, "I want you to take the men down to the spring to drink." And he said, "Let me tell you the ones to keep." Here's what's told us in Judges chapter 7, verse 5. So Gideon took the men down to the water. There the Lord told him, "Separate those who lap the water with their tongues like a dog from those who kneel down to drink." 300 men lapped with their hands to their mouths. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. The Lord said to Gideon, "With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hand. Let the other men go, each to his own place." It's a little confusing and a little intriguing as to how that selection was made. But apparently there were those soldiers who came to this stream, knelt down and stuck their faces into the water and just drank straight from the water. 9,700 did that. But 300 of the soldiers apparently bent over, took water into their hands, and lapped it like a dog. And God said, "I want those 300 to stay." There's been a lot of theories about why God chose the Israelite soldiers on that premise. Some have assumed that perhaps the 300 who lapped standing were ones who were cautiously on guard while the others put their weapons down and stuck their heads in the water. But another theory is exactly the opposite. The possibility that the 300 who stood and lapped were the ones who might have been the clumsiest and the most awkward. And that maybe God was showing the Israelites He was going to save them with the worst of the lot. One thing is sure, God was showing them that numbers were not the issue. He would destroy the army of the Midianites, numbering 135,000 with 300 men. And that battle scene is described in the rest of chapter 7 and on into chapter 8. It's my hope and prayer that each of you viewing will somehow, some way get a chance to go to the Holy Land, to see that part of the world that's not just historical, but it's where God's hand has directly been upon history in such a prominent way. I assure you, if you ever get a chance to go, you'll never read the Bible the same way, because the places that you read about and that you've heard about all your life, suddenly they come to life and you see the actual scene. Well, we're only halfway through our journey. I hope that next week you'll tune in to the Amazing Grace Bible class and see the second half of a video documentary of the tour that we took last April. I believe you'll be inspired if you will, just as you were today. You might even tell a friend so that they can tune in. I'll look forward to seeing you next week on the Amazing Grace Bible class.